there's a particular kind of irony that is helpful for understanding William Blake, and that is called romantic irony. Now, there are many different kinds of irony. You've probably learned about some of them. One of the more common forms is verbal irony, where a speaker says one thing but implies the opposite at the same time. We could say that semantically, in terms of the meaning of the words, syntactically, in terms of the relationship of the words, the sentence says one thing, but rhetorically it says another. And the most famous, or one of the most famous moments of verbal irony is the opening sentence of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. On the one hand, the sentence means semantically what it says, that rich men want to marry women, but given the whole tenor of the novel, it also means the opposite, that women are desirous of marrying rich men. That's verbal irony. We can think of dramatic irony, where members of the audience or the readers know something that a character in the play or the novel do not. Oedipus Rex is a good example of this. There's situational irony, which is probably the kind of irony you learn about in high school, the opposite of what is expected if, say, a fire department burns down, or a police person commits a crime, or a dentist gets a cavity. The opposite of what is expected, situational irony. There is Socratic irony, where one feigns stupidity in order to get the best of another in an argument. But we're talking here about romantic irony. It was a kind of irony developed in 1798. There were some German thinkers, the Schlegel brothers, August and Friedrich Schlegel, and their friend Frederick von Hardenberg, who went by the name Novalis. And they put together what they called their Athenaeum fragments. And in the Athenaeum fragments in 1798, they developed this idea of irony that we're talking about. So basically, romantic irony works this way. The romantic ironist assumes that there is an irreducible gap between word and world. In other words, the way that we describe the world is always inadequate for how the world really is. Put another way, all our belief systems, all our systems of science, all our philosophical systems are inadequate for actually grasping the world as it is. Why? Because the world is too subtle, too nuanced, too superabundant in energy and grandeur for our human-made structures. Now, this could lead to skepticism. Oh my gosh, we cannot gain universal truth through our scientific philosophical inquiries. But for the romantic ironist, this gap between what we say of the world and how the world is actually an invitation to celebrate possibility. Nothing is final in this universe. No utterance is true once and for all. Yes, this leads to epistemological insecurity, but also it leads to the possibility for endless interpretations of a world that is inexhaustible in its meaning. So how does this play out in literature? Well, oftentimes a romantically ironic work of literature will use a self-conscious narrator. It will highlight the fact that, look, this novel or this poem is simply a work of fiction. I'm not trying to pass it off as real. It is fiction, and it could have been written another way, possibly. Lord Byron does this over and over again in his great comic poem, Don Juan. His rhyme scheme suggests that he wanted us to pronounce the poem Don Juan, not Don Juan. Or he's constantly saying, look, I'm having a hard time writing right now because I'm hungover. So there's a way in which the meaning is posited, but also it's undercut at the same time. We see this in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, where the narrator Ishmael is constantly talking about the process of actually writing the book. So that's one way that romantic irony manifests itself, and it puts readers in the position of, what is this book? What is this work? Does it have one meaning? Does it even have one author? So it puts us in a place of interpretive ambiguity. Again, this leads to insecurity, but also it's exciting at the same time. Now, another way that the romantic ironist might work is to create a work of literature that cancels itself out. We see this in the work of Keats quite frequently, in particular in Ode to a Nightingale, where we get to the end of the poem and the poet asks, was this a vision or a waking dream? Do I wake or do I sleep? In other words, is this poem a kind of vision of how the poet's imagination works to make sense of the world and ultimately move out of melancholy? Or was it simply a reverie, a fantasy, a dream? It's both at the same time. Our logic cannot encompass that. So how does romantic irony help us with William Blake? Blake is constantly positing to undercut, which of course again is the basic structure of irony, coming from the Greek word iron, which means to dissimulate, to be one thing and the opposite at the same time. So oftentimes Blake's images work against his words in this way. When we get to the end of the book of Thel, we see Thel seemingly run back to the Vales of Har, the kind of Garden of Eden, because she's horrified of death and sex. But the very last image shows these little children riding on this gigantic serpent. This gigantic phallic creature is being ridden on by these little babies, basically saying, look, there's nothing wrong with the physical world. There's no reason to get all disturbed about sex. So the vision of Thel and the vision suggested by this image at the end of the poem, they work against each other. They push readers to think about a third term. Can we reconcile these two views, or just leave readers in a state of contradiction? Blake also does this verbally, in particular in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he's constantly suggesting that what we think of as hell is really heaven, what we think of as angels are really devils, and vice versa. So pay attention to Blake's use of romantic irony, again, as a way to suggest fecundity, a way to suggest possibility, a way to open readers up to the sublime, to cleanse the doors of perception and have a sense that the world is infinite in its energy and significations.